Welcome back. So, let's start. We were talking about the business cycle, and I would say in the classical context, and we tried to understand that how we can think about the real business cycle model. And under that, we were discussing about the Keynesian perspective. So, as I mentioned that during 1960s, 70s, 80s, when people started accepting the idea of the neoclassicals about how we can think about or we can understand the business cycle dynamics with the help of the behavior of consumer, firm, market, government, we can think about introducing or making the efficient allocation in the economy with regard to the output and employment. So, here this has to deal more with the business cycle dynamics. Now, we were discussing in the last session about the coordinate the strategic complementarity model, and under that we understood that how we can think about an economy which will have different set of rules and regulations to understand. Now, here what we were talking about is the Keynesian coordination failure models. In the last class I had given you the, or in the last session I had given you the brief background, and we were discussing to some extent the complementarities. So, in the economy, when we say about the strategic complementarity, then it implies that the firms are also having incentives, and they also look out for other firms that what they are doing, and in which all activities they are participating. If they think that whatever the firm is producing, and if it is going to be sold immediately to the next firm, or the activities of one firm depend upon the activities of some other firms in the economy, which is very normal case. In the last session I had also given the example of some kind of picnic trip, where you think that if some people are organizing and if everyone is going, then you also feel to participate. If no one is participating, then you also avoid. So, in most of the economies, that is the scenario we have, that when we are discussing about the complementarities, when we talk about the complementarities, we try to see some kind of interdependence, that how in the economy one firm depends upon another. For example, a firm may be selling for example, a software company or the outlook of software company will depend upon how is the outlook of the hardware company. So, if the hardware suppliers are more and if they have a good business, then it is obvious that the software supplier will also have a good amount of sale, and as a result this particular firm will also survive and it will have profitability. But here it all depends upon the expectation. And once I talk about expectation, which is unobservable. So, in the economy, when you have a large set of individuals participating in different types of activities, then it is obvious that you will not have homogeneous expectation. The expectation will vary. So, some of the agents may be expecting or have a very higher expectation about the economy, a business cycle. Some individuals may not be having that kind of outlook. So, depending upon what the individual is considering in its expectation or her or in his or her expectation, that matters a lot. That if the individuals are not just thinking about how they can think about making the expectation. So, maybe it is adaptive, maybe it is rational when they are incorporating all set of information. So, some individuals may be more bullish about the outlook of the economy, whereas some other individuals may not be. So, here you have two types of variables to understand. One is the optimistic scenario, that individuals are very optimistic, and one you have the pessimistic scenario, where individuals are not pessimistic about certain outcomes and they feel that the economy or the outlook may not be better. So, there with regard to interdependence, they have low expectation. Those who are optimistic with regard to interdependence, complementarities, they have higher expectation. So, this creates a scenario that in the economy, if I am assuming to have only two equilibria, where we have where you have the optimistic and you have the pessimistic. If you have two equilibria, then it is easier to understand, but it it can happen that in the economy you may have multiple equilibria, that people may have slightly better expectation, some people may have perfect foresight kind of understanding, some individuals may have no understanding at all. So, those individuals have tried to incorporate. So, in the economy it is not just mix of individuals, it also talks about certain macroeconomic dynamics. So, Keynesian coordination failure model, it helps in that. So here the idea is that unlike the real business cycle model where prices and wages were flexible, and with that we try to understand that how we can think about the aggregation of output, how certain policy variables like for example monetary policy, how assuming the neutrality condition, how it makes all other variables as pro cyclical in the business cycle understanding. Here since it is Keynesian model, so ultimately the objective will be that how with the interference of the government we are making the business cycle understanding better, and more and more variables are making as pro cyclical. So, the idea is very good and it is having lot of applications, and you can apply such models in your understanding about the economy and macroeconomic aspect. So, in some cases this particular model may not be directly applicable. So, then after this we will be talking about the new Keynesian. So, there you will have this is also coming from the salt water, and there you will have the salt water understanding in a much better way. So, here the basic assumption is that in the economy firms are operating, and unlike the constant return to a scale where here you have the increasing returns to a scale. It means that your output increases by if you are doubling the input, your output increases by more than double. So, if it is I am saying. So, here it makes also the increasing return to scale has certain characteristics, that if you are talking about the scenarios where you have a very efficient technology, and this efficient technology is making you produce more and more output, in the same way that we saw in case of real business cycle, that productivity shock created a very favorable scenario for most of the macroeconomic variable. Just to complement that, the Keynesian also introduced some kind of boosting factor into their model, and this increasing returns to a scale acts as a boosting factor, that this augments the rest of the variable. So, this assumption is very stringent assumption, and one of the criticism of the model is also the increasing returns to a scale, which is very rare to find in most of the economies. Maybe certain industries will have such type of production behavior, maybe in case of services industry in terms of earning, that if you are having 4 individuals producing a software, and that software is having higher value, but it also depends that how wide is the application of that software. So, if more and more individuals are adding the dimension of how wide is the application of software, then of course, the demand is going to boost. So, that kind of scenario or that kind of demand based production process may be a good example here. So, here in most of the cases what we saw, that the demand for labor, normally in case of when we talk about demand, it is supposed to be the downward kind of behavior, but here when we say about the labor demand, it has the upward slope because of the increasing returns, and in most of the cases since it is about the increasing returns, which means that labor is also in a big demand, and most of the firms do not shy in hiring this amount of labor. So, the slope of this will be greater than the slope of the labor supply. So, this will be above this. So, this will be more stricter or and compared to the labor supply, which depends upon the rate of interest, again that how is the rate of interest scenario. So, increasing returns to a scale, I would say it imposes certain kind of conditions which may not be easy to digest, and that is what these are the important limitations of this particular model, but let us work out with certain kind of dynamics. For example, we can think about output supply, we can think about the multiple equilibria. So, those things we will be discussing. So, output supply. So, here what we are seeing is that here we have the R1 and with R1. So, here you have the Y and R. So, this axis you have the rate of interest, which is a real rate of interest, where we have inflation as 0. So, we are having both nominal and real equal, coming from the previous to previous when we are talking about the monetary intertemporal model, the Fisherian framework. So, here we have, and here we on the x axis it is the y2 y1, right, and once we have y2 y1, then this shows the output. Now, here we have the production function, and as you can see, when we are assuming the increasing returns to a scale, then here we have the output N1 and demand and supply of labor, here you have N1 here. So, which means that the rate of interest R1, it corresponds to N1 Y1 and then N1, and here you can think about the W1. But suppose you have the scenarios in which you have the rate of interest higher. So, if the rate of interest is higher, then this creates troubles in the this is having some kind of impact, direct impact on the labor supply. So, what happens that in this particular situation, when you have the rate of interest higher, right, maybe the money supply increased. So, if the rate, or you can think about a scenario in which the rate of interest is higher. So, maybe the situation in which we are incurring some kind of equilibrium model, where we are superimposing this condition that in case if the rate of interest is higher, then this is immediately having impact on the employment output. So, here will be employment lower and output will also be lower. But here we have the N2, and N2 what it implies, that because of this rate of interest higher, the representative consumer will be now more looking for substitution effect kind of scenario. When your earnings are higher, you will substitute or I would say you will substitute more of a or you will go for substituting current leisure or future leisure for current leisure when you have the rate of interest higher. So, such kind of substitution, what will immediately it will happen, that here you have the labor supply going down, and as a result you arrive at the equilibrium here, right, it will shift towards a right. So, now individuals will be looking for a higher reward. So, that makes the situation much in at point N2. Once I reach at point N2, then what I find that because of this interest scenario that we have and this output supply, let us first discuss what is output supply. Output supply is the level of equilibrium of the or I would say equilibrium at which the rate of interest, or it shows the relationship between rate of interest and the output at which the labor market clears. The moment I say the output supply curve, then this is what we have to assume. So, with the rate of interest and the output scenarios, we try to understand the equilibrium in the labor market, and labor market equilibrium will always be with regard to the substitution and income effect, because then whenever you have the rate of interest higher, you think that the labor will expect that since the reward is going to be higher in future, right. So, it is better that they will substitute for more I would say leisure. So, this is how it works, and as a result your employment is going to be lower, because people will be now substituting for this higher interest rate scenario creates an opportunity, and as a result what we see is that demand for labor that we have, it is also having a lower scenario, and this is how it works. So, higher interest rate scenarios are not very good for the economy, and this ultimately reduces the employment, reduces the output, and also it also hinders the demand supply scenarios in the labor market. So, this is what we have to understand. Here we have to understand the output supply curve, as I mentioned it that in the framework of interest rate and output, it shows that how the labor market reacts. So, this is how they try and understand. Now, here we are talking about the multiple equilibria. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning that when we have the multiple equilibria, then we can think about a scenario in which we have half of the individuals as an optimistic and half individuals as a pessimistic, but it can happen that there will be multiple equilibria. So, here you have a further degrees of optimism and further degrees of pessimism that you can decide about. So, what typically happens is that here you have a W1 N1 and here you have W2 N2 corresponding to this W1 N1. So, this is the labor market we have, and this is the scenario in which we are talking about the output and the rate of interest. So, here we have a YS and here, so here we have a YS and here we have the YD. So, output demand and output supply, right. Now, you can think about this situation as the pessimistic scenarios where the rate of interest is higher and output is lower. Optimistic scenario corresponds to this R2 and Y2. So, which means that at the lower rate of interest your output is higher. Now, with this particular here when we talk about the money supply, then here money supply is fixed at this price. You can think about the when we have such type of scenario corresponding to R1, right. So, at this rate of interest whenever we see, so at R2 the rate of interest is lower. So, here again you have the money demand changing quite aggressively, and this leads to what we have the rightward shift, right, of the money demand, and this leads to a lower price level. So, this is how it implies. But what is important to understand is that in the low equilibria scenario, one of the reasons could be that because of this particular change that you have here that I mentioned about, that in the pessimistic scenario it may also happen that because of the certain pessimistic expectations, the participation of labor in the economy is much lower because they have very lower expectations. So, they do not supply that much amount of labor, right. So, they will be having some kind of understanding that anyway the wage is not going to increase. So, let us not supply that much amount of labor, let us work for lesser number of hours, and this will create further trouble in the economy. Whereas, in the optimistic scenario, this is quite opposite, that individuals are having higher expectation that the future outlook is going to be better, they will have higher increase in the wage rate because productivity has increased, and this productivity increase will have further increase in their current and future income, and they can think about a higher level of consumption in both periods, and you can directly link this particular scenario with what we have discussed in the intertemporal framework. So, in case optimistic scenario, it becomes easier to understand that how the individuals are reacting to different set of or to different sets of the expectation with regard to the future earnings, future livelihood, future consumption, current consumption. So, here is the best scenario. So, here it becomes more or less augmenting scenarios for the economy. Since the rate of interest is lower, so you can think about the money supply increase, and this money supply increase has resulted in the lower rate of interest, and this has created a better favorable scenario for investment and all others, even consumption, right. And since we have the money demand change and this change is leading to price decline, so this is also good. So, in case of optimistic means good scenarios, what are the situations? The employment increasing, wage rate is increasing, you have the lower interest rate, output is increasing, and also the money demand is also changing, right, and price is getting lower. So, which means that we are able to understand the business cycle in a much better way under this good equilibria, whereas bad equilibria is a scenario where this has to be ruled out. So, in this situation it becomes important to think about the coordination failure. So, what we had understood in the case of a real business cycle model is that we talked about the consumption, which is the pro-cyclical, investment pro-cyclical, employment pro-cyclical, real wage pro-cyclical, average labor productivity also becomes pro-cyclical. So, Keynesians almost countered the idea of the classicals when they mentioned about the real business cycle model, that how when they were emphasizing more on productivity shock, which is also some kind of increasing return to a scale that the Keynesians introduced later. So, once I have the productivity increase, then this is also creating a favorable scenario to understand the business cycle. Keynesians also countered that debate, and then they started this coordination failure model, and they also proved that it also has the same kind of implications on business cycle that we have for the neoclassicals. So, I hope it is clear that how the classical idea and Keynesian ideas are responding to each other and how these two ideas are really useful. So, you can think in that direction. So, here we have the pro cyclical money supply in the coordination failure model. When we have money supply increase, what it leads to, the money demand scenario changes, and as a result what we see is the price decrease. So, here we have money supply increase M1 to in M2, and this leads to what we have the price getting lower, and what the coordination failure model suggests. So, here we have, so let me first give you some idea about that individuals in the economy. So, here the idea is that when will be the situation when we are able to wipe out this W1 N1, and here we have R1 Y1, and here we have P1 scenarios, that when we are able to make this particular context relevant. So, when will be the situation? So, if your economy is doing really good, all the sectors are doing really well, then in that situation it becomes really important. Now, many business cycle theorists link this particular phenomena with regard to what they call it the sunspot theory. In case of sunspot, the idea is that there will be some leading factors in the economy that will further boost the optimism scenarios, and this creates a so the number of pessimists which are there in the economy, and if you have more sunspots in the economy, then the number of pessimists falling in that direction will reduce, and as a result your economy moves in the upward direction, and most of the variables react in a pro cyclical manner. So, sunspot is the major, and even the Keynes suggested that you have animal spirits kind of situation where we think about Alan, I would say Greenspan mentioned about the irrational exuberance, and also he had mentioned about a term which is linked with what we call it the, if you think about the variable, then he had recommended that a stock market can act as a sunspot because it is having some kind of forward looking scenario. So, the bad equilibria and the good equilibria that we have in the economy with regard to the pessimist and optimist. So, good equilibria and bad equilibria. So, good equilibria is linked with the optimistic scenario, bad equilibria linked with the pessimistic scenario. These two scenarios are having good and bad. So, the frequent occurrence of good and good will create always a better scenario. The frequent occurrence of bad and bad will always be having the recessionary scenarios. So, from the business cycle language, this is how it works. So, this is how we try and understand here. So, pro cyclical money supply in the coordination failure model. So, this is how it looks like, that in most of the cases price is going to be downward, and this is coming from here, nothing much to change. Only thing is that you have money supply increase, and why it is happening, because the role of the central bank is that you have to at least control the inflation, and if the central government is not reacting, then that matters a lot. So, if money supply increase, rate of interest is going to be lower, and then you have the money demand changing, and this creates further scenarios for the labor to react accordingly in the labor market, and this further creates the coordination failure problem. Now, here stabilization of fiscal policy in the coordination failure model. So, here what they say about the money supply in the coordination failure model, that unlike the neutrality condition that we superimpose in case of real business cycle, here they do not follow. In most of the in most of the Keynesian economics, what they say that the money supply is money is non-neutral in short run. In the long run, it becomes neutral. So that argument they further carry forward. So here, what is the idea behind? Idea behind is that if suppose you have the, so here you have the Y1D. So here you have the output demand, and here you have the output supply. Here you have here you can think about the bad, and here you have the good, and this is the ideal situation. In ideal situation, what how this is created? This ideal situation is created when you have some kind of taxation or government comes into picture and government cuts the expenditure. If government is going to cut the expenditure, then individuals will also be reacting in the same way. So their present value of current tax will be much lower. Then this makes the understanding easier that people will react in a, so consumption and all other variables will react, and ultimately there will be some kind of convergence. This is what I said, that you have to remove the pessimistic scenarios, move toward the optimistic, and this is how it looks like, that because of the labor market adjustment you have the Y2S now touching upon the. So once I have the Y1D here, so because of this the government expenditure or some kind of positive sentiment given to the households or individuals, this leads to what we have the output almost having the parallel line, and it is shifting down, and this shifting down when it is tangent to Y2S, which is Y1S and Y2S here, then this is having R star and Y star, and this R star and Y star gives us the scenario that the pessimist and optimist scenario can have the a middle path, and this is how it shows. So in case of fiscal policy, what typically happens is that when you have the rate of interest higher at this level, individuals will be of course thinking about how the current will be thinking about current and future leisure, right, which one will be higher and lower. Here at this point the individuals are more comfortable, right, so they have lower interest rate and higher output, but because of these two extreme scenarios, the individuals may also be thinking that let us not go for that kind of work that they used to do earlier. So as a result you have the parallel shifting down, and this is how it works here. There are certain limitations that we normally encounter in case of coordination failure model, that the assumption of increasing returns to a scale makes the model difficult to understand in the real life scenarios. Second thing is about the expectations, that when when you are superimposing expectations with regard to certain macroeconomic scenarios, business cycle scenarios, then it becomes really difficult to understand that how it works. Your expectations are unobservable. So I think all these two limitations we have already highlighted. So I am stopping it here. I hope you have been able to understand the perspective, that how we can think about a scenario where even if you have a Keynesian perspective under flexible and I would say prices, right. So neoclassical, this is what they try to explain from both Keynesian and classical perspective, that how we can understand the business cycle. And since in the Keynesian role of the government becomes important, so they introduce the government also, but unlike the real business cycle, here we are saying that the money supply is not neutral, and the government policy becomes really important to bring stabilization in the economy. So I am stopping it here. Thank you so much.